Hajime!
Greetings, Legionaries. It's good to see you here on the parade deck. A little bit of discipline, a little bit of PT. I hope all of you are constantly improving yourself mentally, physically, spiritually. But I was actually reading this article from War on the Rocks, and I'm sure many of you are aware, if you're an American, the DoD, Department of Defense, which is rightfully called the Department of War, good to go, has been going through a number of reforms. It's been soliciting ideas as regard to what are the critical vulnerabilities that we can strengthen, we can buttress, what are some centers of gravity we can reinforce and reinvigorate, perhaps. And there's a whole slew of topics that are going on, and I thought one of the most thoughtful was about introducing adversity into not simply the recruiting structure, or rather the recruiting process, but also throughout the career of the military individual. An environment in which we introduce conflict and trying institutions and basically adversarial types of agonal, let's say, skill development that elicits the best and excellence from that service member. And this is to be distinguished, of course, for those of you who have been in the military, from like a haze fest, okay? For as much as that does have salubrious and positive effects, what I would say is it brought to the fore something truly interesting, a concept which the idea that it's not simply about introducing into the military life a reinstilling of discipline, a cultural revision of pain as a positive rather than a negative. So in short, we're getting rid of HR. Good to go. We're getting rid of all the weak ass crap that has been infecting the military for the last 30-40 years since Tailhook scandal. This is good. And the only reason why I don't read from this article, because for as much as it is insightful, for as much as it does touch upon a good vector, a cone of ideas to develop the military in the United States, to fix where it's gone wayward, and where we can exceed ourselves beyond any limit that we have thus far achieved. So, you know, I'm not actually a conservative. I hope you understand that, because I actually am a dynamic thinker, a dynamic person. Just because something happened in the past doesn't automatically make it a good thing, okay? Same thing applies to the military traditions, culture, etc. There have been ebbs and flows, there have been peaks and troughs, and the magnitude of those peaks and troughs have varied. The height of American military excellence varies, of course, between the land forces, sea forces, etc. The height of the naval sea forces, the United States as a merchant republic, has always been at the premier arm of the United States military. Both the Navy itself, what you consider to be the Navy, but also the Marine Corps, generally speaking, are held in regard as the highest of military institutions within the United States, with a tradition of active service since, of course, 1776. This is not to detract from the Army, but remember, in the early Republic, the tradition of the Army was really a levée en masse, right? Which is a militia-patterned military with a corps of elite officers that would offer themselves the skeleton to lead combat forces with a small regular force. The overwhelming, let's say, strength projection, the overwhelming let's say, budgetary investment in the military usually went to the Navy in the early Republic. And of course, money doesn't really mean anything as far as combat efficiency and the effect it has on policy and politics in general and the political, right? But this is just to give you a metric of understanding. Now, the Army had its, let's say, flowering of itself during the Civil War, and then later, of course, in World War II. Now we're starting to see the development of combined arms warfare. Highly technologized, but also with the added element of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare in, let's say, the early modern period was completely cleaved from the conventional arms of any state's military or any polity's military. And let me explain to you why. During the Wars of the Reformation, as many of you know, in Europe, there was this war between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it was bloody. It killed millions and millions of Europeans. And finally, these wars culminated into the Peace of Westphalia, which, alongside some of the innovations of the Renaissance, brought to the fore this concept of nation-states, or rather, the nascent understanding of nation-states. And so all military endeavors, though of course leveraged or included in its calculus some collateral damage, it never considered the civilian core, or let's say the civilian, as a combatant. This is where we get many of our cultures, which have been subsequently legislated in the Geneva Conventions or the Rules of War, which basically legislate the rights of civilians and make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, but the paradigm has significantly shifted. This paradigm of shift is, in effect, the era of total war. Starting with World War I, we're starting to see the tendrils, right, with basically mobilizing every sector of a state, including the citizen body. Everyone is a combatant, including the combatants of information. Because for as much as you may think posting on the internet or being a keyboard warrior or whatever you may say is somehow flailing or ineffectual, remember that states all around the world make every effort to have coordinated censorship and, let's say, bot armies to either signal boost or suppress certain cultural currents, right? Zeits of the general eschatology, so to speak. And so information is important, but also with the added element, starting with the Marxists, of course, of leveraging the average citizen into, let's say, paramilitary activities. Whether this might be taking pictures, for instance, of military installations through kind of just whatever open-sourced media, or it is, let's say, doing even acts of sabotage spontaneously. And so ultimately, now the lines have blurred significantly to a point that it hasn't been since 1648, or rather, since before 1648. And so, in the context of the modern military, we need to imbibe values in the average soldier that will rise to the occasion and not merely make him a very specific technical weapon, right? A weapon system, but also a total human being, because he will be interfacing with something that might not be on the level of a combat, let's say, kinetic exchange. It might be something more nebulous, more difficult to actually gauge. You have to interact with the populace and in a way that is meaningful. Prior, we didn't have this issue with insurgencies because in the ancient world, if it were the case that you took over a city and, let's say, a region or a populace was just simply too troublesome, what would happen is you would just massacre everyone. You'd sell everyone to slavery, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, due to Christianity and the softening effects that has, basically we have given them protections from which, as rear operating bases, they attack and act politically asymmetrically to affect political aims. So, for instance, let's say philosophers, newscasters, press agents, publishers, all these individuals are part of a war machine. However, due to the ideas of liberal enlightenment, or what so-called liberal enlightenment, and human rights, etc., it becomes, both in the public eye and state operating procedure, impossible to actually address the threat, unless, of course, you exist in Marxist-Leninist societies, or basically more organic nations that understand that a nation is the totality of its being, its people, its organs of power, etc., and not simply this very narrowly defined military state apparatus, which has very strict lines of what it can or cannot do. So, what does this have to do with the soldier? What does this have to do with the Agonal principle finally being re-imbibed into the soldier? What is this added element which will be necessary in the wars to come? This is exactly what I wanted to peer into, and really it gets down to the core ethos of what a soldier really is, or rather what a warrior is, because it is very easy to define a soldier as him having a battlefield, and on that battlefield he'll see an enemy who is uniformed, who has similar military equipment, and there's a very, let's say, defined parameter as far as what is a combatant or non-combatant, and therefore, because the field of the soldier has been so narrowly and crystallized defined, or rather narrowly defined and crystallized, the enemy has leveraged asymmetries which are outside that circumscription. So what does this mean? It means that basically we have atrophied in the ability to be cruel, right? The reason why, for instance, if you study wars of colonization, wars of counterinsurgency, in the time before the liberal enlightenment, you would hold collective responsibility for certain actions and, of course, incur reprisals. And this was effective. But, of course, there is a fifth column within all Western countries for a very long time who basically, let's say, shed crocodile tears to affect strategic defeats on the morale and fighting will of any one given republic. We can leverage the example of Vietnam, where we had basically hippies subverting the American nation in the war effort by giving these, Hanoi Jane, for instance, by basically, oh, look how terrible is war. But that is war. War is terrible. And so that is the thing that has infected the military since Vietnam specifically, and this lack of a stomach to be able to actually do what is necessary. And so what happens is this half-halving causes us to lose wars, to be infinitely in depth, and never be able to, let's say, achieve the strategic mission, and therefore the reason of the war, and win it with the benefits that come from it. And so I wanted to leverage maybe a short excursion as far as what the warrior ideal is, and by leveraging the armed forces, or an element of the armed forces that are outside of the liberal West's experience thus far. And I would like to turn our minds to the Spetsnaz of the Soviet Union from the late 80s by the same individual who wrote Viktor Suvorov. He was a guy that defected to the West and gave an expose to the interior. A lot of it was designed to promulgate propaganda about how terrible the Soviet Union was, and don't get me wrong, it certainly was terrible, but so much of it also had good qualities as well. Like, I think it's really stupid to, let's say, straw man an opposition. You have to make sure when you're arguing with something, you steel man the opposition, because otherwise you're not going to actually build a compelling case against it, but most importantly, you're never going to actually observe the, let's say, virtues of your enemy and learn from him. And so the Soviet Union really had this great institution regarding special forces, and within that institution, that cultural institution of the special forces, we are revealed as to what it is that the warrior spirit truly is, how it manifests itself, and what elements from that can we re-imbibe into ourselves in the United States, and therefore secure our republic and reinvigorate both the military, the American state, and the American people as a whole. Because remember, these are not separate organs, right? They're all part of one corporate whole. So, without further ado, what I would like to do is read from this book, great book, and I'll link it in the transmission notes below. It's called Spetsnaz, The Inside Story of the Soviet Special Forces by Viktor Suvorov. And I'm going to read 8 chapters, very short. And in this chapter, I'll give some commentary, just so that way you can hear what it's like and we can have some discussions. If you have some ideas, please go ahead and comment below. Obviously, I want you to understand before we deep dive, like, I'm not deep dicking, the freaking the Soviets. What I am saying is, let's examine some of their good elements and maybe use that as inspiration to maybe reintroduce that into ourselves, okay? So be very agnostic. Allow yourself to be like receptive, and then we can reassess. Good to go, Legionaries? Good to go. Alright. I'm reading from Suvorov now. The fighting units of Spetsnaz. Spetsnaz is made up of 3 distinct elements: the fighting units, the units of professional sportsmen, and the network of secret agents. In numerical terms, the fighting units of Spetsnaz are the largest. They're composed of soldiers from the ranks, out of those who are especially strong, especially tough, and especially loyal. A factor that facilitates the selection process is that within the Soviet Army, there exists a hidden system for the selection of soldiers. Long before they put on uniform, the millions of recruits are carefully screened and divided into categories in accordance with the political reliability, their physical and mental development, the extent of their political involvement, and the cleanliness, from the communist point of view, of their personal and family record. The Soviet soldier does not know to which category he belongs, and in fact he knows nothing about the existence of the various categories. If a soldier is included in a higher category than his comrades, that does not necessarily mean that he is fortunate. On the contrary, the best thing for a soldier is to be put into the lowest category and to perform his 2 years of military service in some remote and godforsaken pioneer battalion, which there is neither discipline nor supervision, or in units of which the officers have long since drunk away all the authority they had. And by the way, this is a reference to actually alcoholism in the Soviet military. That is a long-standing Russian tradition. It's a very big problem, frankly, and you still hear stories that are happening in the war right now of basically Russian officers being drunk on the line of contact on duty, so it's a very big problem. Anyway, going ahead. The higher category of the soldier is put into the more difficult service that there can possibly be. Soldiers of the highest category make up the Kremlin Guard, the troops protecting the government communications, the frontier troops, and the KGB and Spetsnaz. Being included in the highest category does not necessarily mean being posted to the Kremlin. to a Spetsnaz brigade, or to a government communications center. The highest category men selected by the local military authorities simply represent the best human material which is offered to the customer, in quotations, for him to choose from. The customer selects only what suits his needs. All those who do not appeal to the customers move down to a lower level and are offered to representatives of the next echelon, that of the strategic missile troops, the airborne forces, and the crews of nuclear submarines. Obviously, small note here, strategic missile troops for the Soviets is basically what we have in the Air Force, which is like ICBMs, RBMs, etc. The young soldier does not recognize or realize, of course, what is going on. He is simply summoned to a room where people he doesn't know ask him a lot of questions. A few days later, he is called to the room again and finds a different set of strangers who are also asking him questions. The system of sorting out recruits reminds one of the system of closed shops for leading comrades. The highest official has the first choice. Then his deputy can go to the shop and choose something from what remains. Then lower-ranking officials are allowed into the shop, then their deputies, and so on. In this system, Spetsnaz rank as the very highest category. The soldiers who have been picked out by the Spetsnaz officers are gathered together into groups and are convoyed by officers and sergeants to fighting units of Spetsnaz, where they are formed into groups and go through an intensive course of training lasting several weeks. At the end of the course, the soldier fires shots from his Kalashnikov automatic rifle for the first time and is then made to take the military oath. The best out of the group of young soldiers are then sent to a Spetsnaz training unit, from which they will return 6 months later with the rank of sergeant, while the rest are posted to fighting units. End quote. So, just as a review, the way that the NCO Corps in the Soviet and now Russian military is not the same as in the West. The way that they select out soldiers, or rather the NCOs in the East, or rather the Soviet Union and the ex-Soviet states, is by effectively doing the following. You basically screen the recruiting pool for the highest IQ, which I guess the parallel would be, right, like highest ASVAB score, and the highest aptitude in basic military skills, and then send them on to a follow-on course where they'll learn the basic rudimentary necessity of knowing basically non-commissioned officer crap. So the similarity would be like corporal's course, sergeant's course, etc. So that's why the NCO Corps is so weak in the Soviet and then later Russian, let's say, military, is because ultimately it has a very weak enlisted corps. These guys are conscripted. They serve 2 years only. They're given additional training, but that does not make up for the fact that they don't have the requisite experience and also the culture handed down generation after generation, which formed the tradition and body of knowledge and reinforce the command culture of any one fighting unit. The challenge which I guess conscript service and the high turnover rate that exists in that kind of conscript service schema usually is deleterious or corrosive to long-standing military formations, especially amongst the enlisted class. This is why there's such an emphasis for officers to know everything. They must know not simply their duties and responsibilities as officers, but must be also proficient enlisted individuals in the sense of all the duties. They must know everything from the technicalities of weapon systems and employment to discipline that is usually imposed by the sergeants and so on. Although I think that's actually a really salubrious addition for the officer corps, which makes them a better officer corps, I do think that this pattern of military is not the best, and we're starting to see how the command and control system, when officers inevitably die on the line of contact or an enemy hostile action, usually a unit doesn't know what to do because they don't have that depth of knowledge to operate from, and are generally speaking lacking the initiative or requisite knowledge to take the initiative and take the fight to the enemy. Well, either way, going back to the text now. In Spetsnaz, as throughout the Soviet army, they observe the cult of the old soldier. All soldiers are divided into stariki, which means old men, and salagi, which means small fry. A real salaga is a soldier who has only just started his service. A really old man, some 20 years old, is one who is about to complete his service in a few months. A man who is neither a real starik nor a real salaga falls between the two. A starik being compared to anyone who has done less time than he has, and a salaga to anyone who has served in the army a few months longer than he. Having been recruited into Spetsnaz, the soldier has to sign an undertaking not to disclose secret information. He has no right ever to tell anyone where he has served or what his service consisted of. At most, he has the right to say that he served with the Airborne Corps. Disclosure of the secrets of Spetsnaz is treated as high treason, punishable by death, according to Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. Once he has completed his 2 years' service in Spetsnaz, a soldier has 3 choices. He can become an officer, in which case he's offered special terms for entering the higher school for officers of the airborne forces in Rizian. I don't know how do you pronounce that shit, but anyway. He can become a regular soldier in Spetsnaz, for which he has to go through a number of supplementary courses, or he has the option to join the reserve. If he chooses the last course, he's regarded as being a member of the Spetsnaz Reserve, and with it for the next 5 years. Then, up to the age of 30, he is part of the Airborne Reserve. After that, he is considered to belong to the Ordinary Infantry Reserve until he is 50. Like any other reserve force, the existence of a Spetsnaz Reserve makes it possible, at a time of mobilization, to multiply the size of the Spetsnaz fighting units with reservists if necessary.
Mud. Nothing but mud all around, and it was pouring with rain. It had been raining throughout the summer, so that everything was wet and hanging limp. Everything was stuck in the mud. Every soldier's boot carried kilograms of it. But their bodies were covered in mud as well, and their hands and faces up to their ears and further. It was clear that the sergeant had not taken pity on the young Spetsnaz recruits that day. They had been called upon only a month before. They had been formed up into a provisional group and been put through a month's course for young soldiers, which every one of them would remember all his life in his worst nightmare. That morning, they had been divided into companies and platoons. Before letting them back into their mud-covered, sodden tent at the end of the day, each sergeant had time to show his platoon the extent of his authority. "Get inside!" There were 10 young men crowded around the entrance to the huge tent, as big as prison barracks. "Get inside, damn you!" the sergeant urged them on. The first soldier thrust aside the heavy, wet tarpaulin, which served as a door, and was about to enter when something stopped him. On the muddy, much trampled ground, just inside the entrance, a dazzlingly white towel had been laid down in place of a doormat. The soldier hesitated, but behind him the sergeant was pushing and shouting, "Go on in, damn you!" The soldier was not inclined to step on the towel. At the same time, he couldn't make up his mind to jump over it, because the mud from his boots would inevitably land on the towel. Eventually he jumped, and the others jumped across the towel after him. For some reason, no one dared to take the towel away. Everyone could see that there was some reason why it had been put there right in the entrance. A beautiful, clean towel, with mud all around it. What was it doing there? A whole platoon lived in one huge tent. The men slept in 2-tier metal bunks. The top bunks were occupied by the stariki, the old men of 19 and even 19 and a half, who had already served a year or even 18 months in the Spetsnaz. The salagi slept on the bottom racks. They had served only 6 months.
By comparison with those who were now jumping over the towel, they were coarse Stariki too. They had all in their day jumped awkwardly across the towel. Now they were watching silently, patiently, and attentively to see how the new men behaved in that situation. The new men behaved as anybody would in their situation. Some pushed from behind, and there was the towel in front. So they jumped, and clustered together in the center of the tent, not knowing where to put their hands or where to look. It was strange. They seemed to want to look at the ground. All the young men behaved in exactly the same way, a jump into the crowd and eyes down. But no, the last soldier behaved quite differently. He burst into the tent, helped by a kick of the sergeant. On seeing the white towel, he pulled himself up sharply, stood on it in his dirty boots, and proceeded to wipe them as if he were standing on a doormat. Having wiped his feet, he didn't join the crowd, but marched to the far corner of the tent where he had been seen a spare bed. "Is this mine?" "It's yours," the platoon shouted approvingly. "Come here, mate. There's a place here. Do you want to eat?" That night, all the young recruits would get beaten, and they would be beaten on the following nights. They would be driven out into the mud barefoot, and they would be made to sleep in the lavatories, standing up or lying down as you wish. They would be beaten with belts, with slippers, and with spoons, with anything suitable for causing pain. The Stariki would use the salagi on which to ride horseback in battles with their friends, and the salagi would clean the old men's weapons and do their dirty jobs for them. There would be the same goings-on as in the rest of the Soviet army. The Stariki, everywhere, play the same kind of tricks on the recruits. The rituals and the rules are the same everywhere. The Spetsnaz differs from other branches only in that they place dazzlingly clean towels at the entrances of each tent for the recruits to walk over. The sense of this particular ritual is clear and simple. We are nice people. We welcome you, young man, cordially into our friendly collective. Our work is very hard, the hardest in the whole army, but we do not let it harden our hearts. Come into our house, young man, and make yourself at home. We respect you, and will spare nothing for you. You see, we have even put a towel with which to wipe our faces for you, to walk on in your dirty feet. And that's it? Is it? You don't accept our welcome? You reject our modest gift? You don't even wish to wipe your boots on what we wipe our faces with? What sort of people do you take us for? You may certainly not respect us, but why did you come into our house with dirty boots? Only one of the salagi, the one who had wiped his feet on the towel, will be able to sleep undisturbed. He will receive his full ration of food and will clean only his own weapon. And perhaps the Stariki will give instructions that he should not do even that. There are many others in the platoon to do it. Where on earth could a young 18-year-old soldier have learnt about the Spetsnaz tradition? Where could he have heard about the white towel? Spetsnaz is a secret organization which treasures its traditions and keeps them to itself. A former Spetsnaz soldier must never tell tales. He'll lose his tongue if he does. In any case, he is unlikely to tell anyone about the towel trick, especially someone who has yet to be called up. I was beaten up, so let him be beaten up as well, he reasons. There are only 3 possible ways the young soldier could have found out about the towel. Either he simply guessed what was happening himself. The towel had been laid down at the entrance, so it must be to wipe his feet on. What else could it be for? Or perhaps his elder brother had been through the Spetsnaz. He had, of course, never called it by that name or said it what it was for, but he might have said about the towel. Watch out, brother. There are some units that have some very strange customs. But just take care. If you let on, I'll knock your head off. And I can. Or his elder brother might have spent some time in a penal battalion. Perhaps he had been in a Spetsnaz and in a penal battalion. For the customs of laying out a towel in the entrance before the arrival of recruits did not originate in Spetsnaz, but in the penal battalions. It is possible that it has handed on to the present day penal battalions from the prisoners of the past.
The links between Spetsnaz and the penal battalions are invisible, but there are many and very strong. In the first place, service in the Spetsnaz is the toughest form of service in the Soviet Army. The physical and psychological demands are not only increased deliberately to the very highest point that a man can bear, they are frequently and also deliberately taken beyond any permissible limits. It is quite understandable that a Spetsnaz soldier should find he cannot withstand these extreme demands and breaks down. The breakdown may take many different forms: suicide, severe depression, hysteria, madness, or desertion. As I was leaving an intelligence unit of a military district on promotion to Moscow, I suddenly came across, on a little railway station, a Spetsnaz officer I knew being escorted by 2 armed soldiers. "What on earth are you doing here?" I exclaimed. "You don't see people on the station more than once in a month." "One of my men run away." "A new recruit?" "That's the trouble. He's a starik. Only another month to go." "Did he take his weapon?" "No, he went without it." I expressed my surprise, wished the lieutenant luck, and went on my way. How the search ended I do not know. At the very next station, soldiers of the Interior Ministry's troops were searching the carriages. The alarm had gone out all over the district. Men run away from the Spetsnaz more often than from any of the branches of the services, but it is usually a case of a new recruit who had been stretched to the limit, and who usually takes a rifle with him. A man like that will kill anyone who gets in his path, but he is usually quickly run down and killed. But in this case, it was a starik who had run off with a rifle. Where had he gone? Why? I didn't know. Did they find him? I didn't know that either. But of course they found him. They're good at that. If he wasn't carrying a rifle, he would not have been killed. They don't kill people without reason. So what could he expect? 2 years in a penal battalion, and then the month in Spetsnaz that he had not completed. Spetsnaz has no distinguishing badge or insignia, officially at any rate. But unofficially, the Spetsnaz badge is a wolf, or rather a pack of wolves. The wolf is a strong and proud animal, which is remarkable for its quite incredible powers of endurance. A wolf can run for hours through deep snow at great speed, and then, when he scents his prey, put on another astonishing burst of speed. Sometimes he will chase his prey for days, reducing it to the state of exhaustion. Exploiting their great capacity for endurance, wolves first exhaust, then attack animals noted for their tremendous strength, such as the elk. People say rightly that the wolf lives on its legs. Wolves will bring down a huge elk not so much by the strength of their teeth as by the strength of their legs. The wolf also has a powerful intellect. He is proud and independent. You can tame and domesticate a squirrel, a fox, or even a great elk with bloodshot eyes. And there are many animals that you can be trained to perform. A performing bear can do readily miraculous things, but you cannot tame a wolf or train it to perform. A wolf lives in a pack, a closely knit and well-organized fighting unit of frightful predators. The tactics of a wolf pack are the very embodiment of flexibility and daring. The wolf's tactics are an enormous collection of various tricks and combinations, a mixture of cunning and strength, confusing maneuvers, and sudden attacks. No other animal in the world could better serve as a symbol of the Spetsnaz. And there is good reason why the training of a Spetsnaz soldier starts with the training of his legs. A man is as strong and as young as his legs are strong and young. If a man has a sloppy way of walking, and if he drags his feet along the ground, he means he is himself as a weak man. On the other hand, a dancing, springy gait is a sure sign of physical and mental health. Spetsnaz soldiers are often dressed up in uniform of other branches of the services and stationed in the same military camps as other especially secret units, usually with communications troops. But one doesn't need any special experience to pick out the Spetsnaz man from the crowd. You could tell him by the way he walks. I shall never forget one soldier who was known as the Spring. He was not very tall. He was slightly stooping and round-shouldered, but his feet were never still. He kept dancing around the whole time. He gave the impression of being restrained only by some invisible string, and if the string were cut, the soldier would go on jumping, running, and dancing, and never stop. The military commissariat, whose job it was to select the young soldiers and sort them out, paid no attention to him, and he fetched up in an army missile brigade. He had served almost a year there, and when the brigade had to take part in maneuvers in which a Spetsnaz company was used against them, when the exercise was over, the Spetsnaz company was fed there in the forest next to the missile troops. The officer commanding the Spetsnaz company noticed the soldier in the missile unit who kept on dancing about all the time. He was standing in the queue for his soup. "Come over here, soldier." The officer drew a line on the ground. "Now jump." The soldier stood on the line and jumped from there without any run-up. The company commander did not have anything with him to measure the length of the jump, but there was no need. The officer was experienced in such things and knew what was good and what was excellent. "Get into my car." "I cannot, Comrade Major, without my officer's permission." "Get in and don't worry. You'll be all right with me. I will speak up for you and tell the right people where you've been." The company commander made the soldier get into his car, and an hour later presented him to the chief of army intelligence, saying, "Comrade Colonel, look what I've found amongst the missile troops." "Now then, young man, let's see you jump." The soldier jumped from the spot. This time there was a tape measured handy, and it showed that he had jumped 2 meters and 41 centimeters. "Take the soldier into your lot and find him the right sort of cap," the colonel said. The commander of the Spetsnaz company took off his own blue beret and gave it to the soldier. The chief of intelligence immediately phoned the chief of staff of the army, who gave the appropriate order to the missile brigade. Forget you ever had such a man. The dancing soldier had been given the nickname the Spring on account of his flexibility. He had never previously taken a serious interest in sport, but was a born athlete. Under the direction of experienced trainers, his talents were revealed and immediately performed brilliantly. A year later, he had completed his military service and was already clearing 2 meters and 90 centimeters. He was invited to join the professional athletic service of Spetsnaz, and he agreed. So, just as a small aside, two different notes. Earlier, you may recall the collective, the soldier collective. So, in the Soviet army, there is this institution in which the party exercised its control, its political control, through what was called soldier collectives. And this was pervasive throughout Soviet society, in which you would basically get around, and it was groups of, I think, 4 or 5, and there would be one, like, let's say, not commissar, but non-official commissar, and this is how they do political education, but this is how they would do what is called, in Marxist thought, self-criticism. And, in effect, it's a way of instilling both political, philosophical discipline, but also effective discipline in the sense of you could be held accountable for failing your duty, etc. But over time, the importance of collective organization is the, let's say, the emphasis on the supra-individual will, right? That you focus on the team. You're part of a team. And so it was a way to create teams, right? To create a higher unity through team effort, to be associated and judged as a team collectively as opposed to individually. This is something that I think is interesting, especially because in the military, in American society, right, we're very mercantile, unfortunately. We're very shopkeeperish. But everyone knows that in the military, and especially in life, teams win over individuals. Good to go? The kinds of people that push individuals are the types of people that are trying to subjugate you. Because remember, the first and foremost strategy of conquering an enemy is dividing them. And who is no more divided than the atomic individual? I think this is important not simply in military culture that we should instill an idea of unit over the individual, but over in society as a whole, where family comes first, not the individual, or nation comes first, not the individual. Individualism is a form of corrosive. It's an acid designed to destroy you and make you into an atomic cog of some corporation. Okay? So this is actually a good thing. Second thing, just talking about the measurements here. So 2 meters and 41 centimeters and 2 meters and 90 centimeters is roughly a distance from a standing position of 7 feet to 8 feet. That's pretty substantial. For those of you who don't know what those metric terms are in imperial distances. But I return here. The long jump with no run had been undeservedly forgotten and is no longer included in the program of official competitions. When it was included in the Olympic Games, the record set in 1908 was 3 meters and 33 centimeters. As an athletic skill, the long jump without a run is the most reliable indication of the strength of a person's legs. And the strength of his legs is a reliable indicator of the whole physical condition of a soldier. Practically, half a person's muscles are to be found in his legs. Spetsnaz devotes the colossal attention to development of the legs of its soldiers and its men, using many simple but effective exercises: running upstairs, jumping with ankles tied together, up a few steps and down again, running up steep sandy slopes, jumping down from a great height, leaping from moving cars and trains, knee bending with a barbell on the shoulders. So in other words, squats, right? Barbell squats. I return. Let's see. And of course, the jump from a spot, right? So jumping statically. At the end of the 1970s, the Spetsnaz record in this exercise, which has not been recognized by the official sports authorities, the maximum was 3 meters and 51 centimeters. Spetsnaz soldier knows that he is invincible. This may be a matter of opinion, but other people's opinions do not interest the soldier. He knows himself that he is invincible, and that's enough for him. The idea is instilled into him carefully, delicately, and not too insistently, but continually and effectively. The process of psychological training is inseparably linked to this physical toughening. The development of a spirit of self-confidence and of independence, and of a feeling of superiority over any opponent, is carried out at the same time as the development of the heart, the muscles, and the lungs. The most important element in training a Spetsnaz soldier is to make him believe in his own strength. A man's potential is unlimited. A man can reach any heights in his life in any sphere of activity. But in order to defeat his opponents, a man must first overcome himself, combat his own fears, his lack of confidence and laziness. The path upwards is one of continual battle with oneself. A man must force himself to rise sooner than others and go to bed later. He must exclude from his life everything that prevents him from achieving his objective. He must subordinate the whole of his existence to the strictest regime. He must give up taking days off. He must use his time to the best possible advantage and fit in even more than was thought possible. A man aiming for a particular target can succeed only if he uses every minute of his life to the maximum advantage for carrying out his plan. A man should find 4 hours sleep quite sufficient, and the rest of his time can be used for concentrating on the achievement of his objective. I imagine that to instill this psychology into a mass-formed army by means of compulsory mobilization would be impossible and probably unnecessary. But in separate units, carefully composed of the best human material, such a philosophy is entirely acceptable. In numbers, Spetsnaz amounts to less than 1% of all the Soviet armed forces in peacetime. Spetsnaz is the best, carefully selected part of the armed forces, and the philosophy of each man's unlimited potential has been adopted in its entirety by every member of the organization. It is a philosophy which cannot be put into words. The soldier grasps it not by his head, but with his feet, his shoulders, and his sweat. He soon becomes convinced that the path to victory and self-perfection is a battle within himself, with his own mental and physical weakness. Training of any kind makes sense only if it brings a man to the very brink of his physical and mental powers. To begin with, he must know precisely the limits of his capabilities. For example, he can do 40 press-ups. He must know his figure precisely, and that really it is the limit of his capacity. No matter how he strains, he cannot do more. But every training session is a cruel battle to beat his previous record. As he starts a training session, a soldier has to promise himself that he will beat his own record today, or he will die in the attempt. The only people who become champions are those who go into every and each training session as if they were going to their death or to their last battle in which they were either win or die. The victor is the one for whom victory is more important than life. The victor is the one who dives a centimeter deeper than his maximum depth, knowing that his lungs will not hold out and that death lies beyond his limit. And once he has overcome the fear of death, the next time he will dive even deeper. Spetsnaz Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Salnikov, world champion and Olympic champion swimmer, repeats the slogan every day. Conquer yourself, and that was why he defended and defeated everyone at the Olympic Games. An excellent place to get to know and to overcome oneself is the Devil's Ditch, which has been dug at the Spetsnaz Central Training Center near Kirovograd. I have no idea where that is, by the way. Next. It is a ditch with metal spikes stuck to the bottom. The narrowest width is 3 meters, and from there it gets wider and wider. Nobody is forced to jump the ditch. But if somebody wants to test himself, to conquer himself, and to overcome his own cowardice, let him go and jump. It can be a standing jump or a running jump in running shoes and a tracksuit with heavy boots and a big rucksack on your back, or carrying a weapon. It's up to you. You start jumping at the narrow part and gradually move outwards. If you make a mistake, trip on something, or don't reach the other side, you land with your side on the spikes. There are not many who wanted to risk their guts at the Devil's Ditch, until a strict warning was put up, only for real Spetsnaz fighters. Now nobody has to be invited to try. There are always plenty of people there, and always somebody jumping, summer and winter, on slippery mud and snow, in gas masks and without them, carrying an ammunition box hand in hand, with hands tied together, and even with someone on the back. The man who jumps the Devil's Ditch has a confidence in himself, considers himself invincible, and has grounds for doing so. The relations within Spetsnaz units are very similar to those within the wolf pack. We do not know everything about the habits of the ways of wolves, but I have heard Soviet zoologists talk about the life and behavior of wolves, and listening to them, I have been reminded of Spetsnaz. They say the wolf has not only a very developed brain, but is also the noblest of all the living things that inhabit our planet. The mental capacity of the wolf is reckoned to be far greater than the dog's. What I have heard from experts who have spent their entire lives in the Taiga of the Uzuri, coming across wolves every day, is sharply at odds with what people say about them, who have seen them only in zoos. The experts say that the she-wolf never kills her sickly wolf cubs. She makes her other cubs do it. The she-wolf herself gives the cubs the first lesson in hunting in a group. The cubs' first victim is their weaker brother, but once the weaker ones are disposed of, the she-wolf protects the rest. In case of danger, she would rather sacrifice herself than let anyone harm them. By destroying the weaker cubs, the she-wolf preserves the purity and strength of her offspring, permitting only the strong to live. This is the very close process of selection within Spetsnaz. At the outset, the weaker soldier is naturally not killed, but thrown out of the Spetsnaz into more restful service. When a unit is carrying out a serious operation behind enemy lines, however, the wolf cubs of Spetsnaz will kill their comrade without a second thought if he appears to weaken. The killing of the weak is not the result of a court decision, but of lynch law. It may appear to be an act of barbarism, but it is only by doing so
that the wolves have retained their strength for millions of years and remained masters of the forest until such a time as even more frightful predator, man, started to destroy them on a massive scale. But the she-wolf has also another reputation, and it is no accident that the Romans for centuries had a she-wolf as a symbol of their empire. A strong, wise, cruel, and at the same time caring and affectionate she-wolf reared 2 human cubs. Could there be a more apt archetype of love and strength? End quote. You see, Legionaries, is actually really interesting and important. As you can see the dichotomy, or rather juxtaposition, between what we conceive of, especially those of you who are service members or have been in the armed services in the United States, and of those in Western Europe, though I do plead ignorance because I am not very much aware of what it's like to be on the inside of those organizations in the Western European sphere. However, what I would like to say is thus, that ultimately soldier archetypes are more motivated by competition than by cooperation. Now, this is not to discount cooperation, right? This is to give it a little bit of a, let's say, nuance, or to correct a little bit this overcorrection. And what I mean by is this. It's very interesting that, first of all, it's not simply the symbology of the wolf or the analogous, let's say, archetype of the she-wolf of Romulus and Remus and the Romans, but also in the military martial culture of the Romans themselves, for instance, is very interesting, and many allusions and parallels that exist. So, for instance, every time the Roman legion would go out, much of its activities would ultimately be a big competition. So, for instance, when they were to create camp and set grounds, each cohort immediately, because every time the Romans moved, they would go and set up an identical pattern of fortification, a square, and so that way every time they moved, their fort and their tent in that fort would be in the identical spatial position and relation as every other. And so when a Roman general said, okay, let's build this fort for the night, set out the cohorts each had a responsible layer or level of the fortress to dig, so the ditch, the walls, the watchtowers, etc., and to encourage the soldiers to create it well and to ultimately make it quickly, they would encourage a competition, and the cohort who would win would have some kind of special privilege, etc. But this was consummate. The Agonal principle of competition was pervasive, not simply between unit and unit, but individual within those units, and so on. And a sense of hierarchy necessary to be able to give people, let's say, a sense of seniority and achievement. And if you read this book, many of those same traditions are present in the Soviet military as they explain it. The Stariki and the Stalagi, or whatever the hell it's called. Same thing applies, and we should reintroduce it into the military. Ever since the liberals came into power and legislated basically anti-ostracization laws, or absurd no hazing, no this or that, we have, the military culture has declined. It has not improved, it's declined. And because ultimately what is implicit in, let's say, the absence of shame is the absence of honor, right? Because these things are two sides of the same coin. You cannot negate the one for the other. In the same way, you can't negate hate by saying love. Like, this is the absurdity of a Whiggian puritanical BS that we learned from liberals who I think are not very self-conscious. They have a lot of cognitive dissonance because, for instance, they talk about love all the time, but I've never seen so much hate emanate from one person so consummately, so viciously, so consistently. And, Nietzsche talks about this, but ultimately,
all human emotions and examples presuppose a, let's say, implicit antithesis. And so part of the military culture is shame and honor, glory and destitution, right? And it's basically, it's important to re-inculcate into the military machine a sense of competition, a sense of the Agonal principle, right? I keep on talking about this because it's essential, but life builds in adversity. It doesn't build in cooperation. Cooperation is a tactic to overcoming adversity, but adversity is the element that incites overcoming, self-overcoming, overcoming of obstacles without, and so on. We need to be introducing adversity into daily military life. We need to be introducing competition, salubrious competition, into every facet of our being, into every element of our, let's say, daily military life. Because most men, especially of the higher type, are motivated by competition, by proving oneself. And this goes in close hand in glove with the idea of will to power, as in the Nietzschean concept that every human organism exists to exude itself, to become master of its environment, to master others. And so when we create this very effeminate military culture, which disallows competition, disallows adversarial relations between companions, because the best friends that you'll ever have in this life, you may have fellow feeling, and they may be your brothers, but brothers also, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had a brother, but you get in fistfights sometimes, you shame each other for being weak, you motivate people to be strong, but this doesn't come at the cost of the greater whole. Because, think about it this way, when your brother is getting picked on by somebody else, well, you close ranks real fast. Just like a wolf pack. And so, I would like to develop this idea more thoroughly over time, but really our military and civilian culture in general is suffering from pacifism. It's suffering from complacency. It's suffering from these effeminate and effete ideals of, let's say, non-aggression, which is also false. I mean, it always manifests itself as passive aggressiveness, and what happens is the cumulus. And the cumulus, the fruits of that tree, have rendered us Miley, not Hackworth, have rendered us, whatever that disgusting thing, admiral, whatever freak that exists, and not someone like John Paul Jones. So I want to leave it there. I don't want to drag out this analysis, but what I'd like you to do in your mind is to come up with ideas of how we could introduce competition into the culture, to be competitive, to give an affirmative value to adversity, to embrace pain in a positive sense as an opportunity of self-overcoming, of discipline and determination as goods, and to completely move away from humility, move away from things that subject ourselves to those who are less than ourselves. Because what happens is you lessen yourself, and over time you become an atomic cipher just like they expect you to be. And I want you to be lions. I want you to be wolves. And without further ado, this is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes, and this is Bruta Historia, signing off. Oh!